Hello, everybody. Today we're doing Exploring World History, lesson number 19, talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. Previous lesson, we talked about understanding sin and being able to understand history through the eyes of sin. And today we want to talk a little bit more about that. And we have to understand that sin affects everyone. And some of the lessons that we'll see from Sodom and Gomorrah. First, let's go back and talk about sin, right? We had early sin, first being with Adam and Eve, and the sin that occurred in the Garden of Eden that caused sin to be basically enter the world. Then we had Cain who killed Abel, and from there we talked about the lineage of Cain was people who were sinning and not doing right in the eyes of God. Then we had the Tower of Babel, and at the Tower of Babel, there was so much sin there that God confused the languages. But even sin enters the modern world, and we see that throughout all kinds of different things. Throughout the United States, we've seen it in Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, like I said, here in America, and some of the policies and things that are going on currently. So ultimately, we know that sin is a problem. And so, if you sit there and look at sin as the problem, you say, what is the solution? And we as Christians know that the solution is easy. The solution is God. Through his mercy and justice, he provides us an escape and a way out from our sin, and that's through Jesus. He provides us the way out of bondage to our sin. So looking back at, the ancient history part, we'll go back to Abraham. Abraham and God had a relationship where they were able to spend time together and talk together. And, promised him a child, which he wasn't sure about, and he thought this wasn't going to work. He eventually gets that child, but also have the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is really where we're headed to and talking about today. Sodom and Gomorrah basically was a sin city, full of sins, full of evil, full of things that shouldn't have been going on. And unfortunately, Lot, Abraham's nephew, was living in Sodom. He had chosen to live there long before, he and Abraham started a split because they were getting too big with their cattle. Lot went one way, Abraham went the other, and Lot settled in the area of Sodom. And eventually Sodom became just this filthy, sinful city. And God sees the sin of the city and pronounces judgment on it. At this point, Abraham goes to God and he says, my family, Lot is there and his family. And so Abraham starts to discuss his problem with God. And it says in Genesis 18, verse 25, Abraham says, "So not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" So Abraham knew that God would. Abraham showed that God will do the right thing always. And it shows that Abraham had trust in God and that God is trustworthy. However, there was still sin and God is just. So God's was going to do his punishment on Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham basically said, well, he's basically negotiating with God and he's trying to work this out and trying to save his family, more importantly than anybody else. So he starts with 50 people. Said, God, if we can find 50 righteous people, will you save the city? God says, sure. And then, Abraham starts going, well, what about 40? What about 30? And he gets all the way down to, what if we just find 10 righteous people, God? If you find 10 people, righteous people, will you save the city? God said yes. But they couldn't find even 10 people, 10 righteous people in the whole city. So after this, we have some angels that were sent to the city to warn Lot and his family, okay? And so they get to the city, and they go to Lot's house, and Lot begs them to come inside so no harm will come to them. Lot basically at this point realizes that the city is so horrible and so awful that he needs them to come inside so he can try to protect them. So they eventually come into his house, and then the people of the city, they saw these two men come into the city they thought were men, and they start banging on Lot's door, demanding that the men come out because they basically want to have sex with them. They're going to forcibly have sex with these men because that's what they wanted to do. And Lot's like, no, we can't do this. So instead, Lot offers up his daughters. And what a horrible thing to even think that would happen, any of it, but especially the point where Lot decides, I'll just send my daughters out there instead of these two men. The next day, the city's going to get destroyed. And they're leaving the city, and Lot and his family are barely escaping. And they get told, you cannot turn back and look at the city, or you'll turn to a pillar of salt. Unfortunately for Lot, his wife turns back, regardless of the warning, in spite of the warning, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Fire and brimstone rain down from heaven on this city, and the city is ultimately destroyed. So you may be thinking, Mr. Jeff, what's the point of this story? What's the legacy? What's the reasons we're talking about Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, first and foremost, it's an example of sin. It's repeatedly used in the Bible as such an example. Sin and sinfulness. It's a symbol of wickedness, even in today's world. Our non-biblical people will talk about, something being bad, so it was like Sodom and Gomorrah. And when we forget how the impact of sin and what sin has on us, then we forget the lesson and we return to sin. There's also some important things that we can learn from the power of influence on sin in our lives and in the world. So to start with, the first thing, Lot stayed there. He knew it was sinful city. He knew how bad it was just by, the actions he did that night. But he chose to stay. He let his daughters be engaged to these men of Sodom, and he was willing to send out his daughters to these angry men. And so when we look at this story and this examples, we need to do two things. Realize that sin influences the events of history, but it also is something that we have to be careful in our lives, because sin can greatly influence us. And the longer we stay either in sin or around sin, the more dangerous it becomes for us. And that's the example we get from Lot. Thanks.